Welcome back to Perkins Pipes YTPC. We're going back into Ancient Space Part 2. Had a neat episode last time, and we need to talk more about that today. Last time I had the rather shiny bent prints that I had made. This time we're going to go with the rusticated black bent Dublin, the Georg Jensen bent Dublin. So staying with black and bent shapes for these two videos. Let's get this guy lit. Let's get to talking. So last time we were talking about ancient science, and we were talking about some of the ideas, the theories of Plato and Aristotle, even the Roman philosopher Cicero, the first science fiction author Lucian of Samosata, the ancient Greek philosopher Democritus and his atomic theory, and the writings of the Roman poet Lucretius, also on atomic theory. But in this episode, I want to talk a little bit about, I want to talk about a couple other things. I want to talk about quantum theory and language. So, going back to Plato for a minute, I'm going to bring up one of my favorite passages. I used to read this in translation with high school students, a dialogue of Plato called the Theaetetus. And in it, the character of Socrates, who was Plato's teacher, he's talking with another young man named Theaetetus. And they're talking about the ideas of one of the pre-Socratic philosophers, a fellow named Protagoras. And at one point, Socrates, the character Socrates, quotes a line from Protagoras. And let me bring that up for you here. He says, Ponton crematon metron anthropon Aeneid, ton men onton hos esti, ton de me onton hos uk estin. Which translates to, man is the measure of all things, of things that are that they are, and of things that are not that they are not. Now, you may have even heard that line, man is the measure. That's where this is coming from. It is a line from the pre-Socratic philosopher Protagoras, quoted by Plato in this dialogue, the Theaetetus. And it comes from the mouth of the character Socrates. Now, as the dialogue progresses, Plato, through the mouthpiece of Socrates, shows that this is absolute rubbish. It's absolute nonsense. It's a radical form of relativism, right? That each person is the sole determiner for what is true. And for example, you and I both look at an object. I say it is red. You say it's blue. And according to this doctrine of Protagoras, we would both be correct. All right. Well, that's just kind of nonsense. And you can have all kinds of other examples of this. And I would bring this up with my students when we would talk about it. I'd say, well, it's nonsense if you assume that there are an infinite number of separate worlds, okay? And ultimately, the character Socrates shows how if you believe that, then ultimately language itself breaks down. You can't even have conversation with people. Words would actually have no meaning, okay? And we're not going to get into the whole dialogue here. Don't have time for that. But that's where it goes. But I would bring up to them, one of the interpretations, right, of quantum theory says that, well, it's not so much that there are many separate worlds, but that the world, by world I don't just mean Earth, but all of reality, is a complex world. And that whenever you that you can't really determine something until you take a measurement of it. You may have heard of this. You can't determine, say, an electron's velocity and its position all at the same time. You got to take one kind of a measurement or another. It leads to some rather startling conclusions that light is both wave and particle, although those seem to be contradictory forms, depending on the kind of experiment one sets up. And again, we're not going to go into deep physics on all this. But by one fairly standard interpretation of quantum theory, you could argue that Protagoras was correct in his statement. And I'm not saying that Protagoras was some sort of prophet for quantum mechanics. That's ludicrous. No, we're not saying that. But it is interesting, again, as we were saying in the previous video, that ancients had some of these kinds of ideas that have actually borne out and been refined and so forth in the modern world. Now, from there, I want to take you to an example of that in language, and I want to call up a passage here from Vergil's epic work, the Aeneid. And this is the epic poem of ancient Rome. These are the first 7 lines of it. So if you'll indulge me, I'd like to read those for you in Latin. And there's something that's kind of quantum interesting about these lines of poetry. Arma virumque cano Troiae, qui primus aboris Italiam fato profugus, laviniaque venit littera, multile terris iactatus ad alto, vi supram saevae memorum unonis abiram. Multa quoquit bello passus, dum conderet urbem, inferretque Deus latio genus unde Latinum, albanique patres at qualtae moenia Romae. And it starts off with this famous opening, I sing of arms and a man who first from the shores of Troy to Italy, driven by fate, came to Lavinian shores, much tossed about that man on land and on the deep, by the power of the gods above, on account of the remembering anger of savage Juno. He endured much also in war, while establishing his city, and was bringing his gods to Latium, from whence came the Latin people, the Alban fathers, and now we get to the last 3 words. Altae moenia Romae. Now, even if you're not a Latin person, that's fine. But you can recognize that the word altae ends with the letters AE, as does Romae. So you think that those 2 words go together, and indeed they do. They go together grammatically. The word altae means tall or high, and its grammatical form is matching Romae. So the phrase could mean the walls of high Rome, keeping high modifying Rome. But then again, we all know that the walls, especially city walls, are tall. So the sense of it is also the tall walls of Rome. And here's the interesting thing about that. As with this one interpretation of quantum theory, it basically means both until you take a measurement, right? Until you settle on a particular interpretation, it means both. And that's why if you look in English translations, they can only have one or the other. You'll see translations that would maybe have the walls of high Rome. You might have the high walls of Rome. In English, we can't have both. Latin is capable of expressing both. And I guess it's a curiosity of the language that you could have both of those that then only get resolved one way or the other by a measurement, as it were, or by a translation. And the other thing that I wanted to bring out was a little point of both Greek and Latin grammar. In Greek and Latin, and this is true in some other languages as well, we have what we call noun cases. All right. So, for example, in English, we have the word boy, B-O-Y. Right. And if you say, the boy rides his bike, I see the boy, I am walking with the boy, right? It's still B-O-Y every single time. But in Latin and Greek, you would spell that word boy differently because it's being used differently in the different sentences, right? One time it's the subject, one time it's the direct object, one time it's the object of a preposition. And so Greek and Latin say, hey, those are really different uses. You should spell the word differently, okay? Well, there is a case in Greek and Latin, a noun case or a form of nouns called the accusative case. And one of the uses of the accusative case, I'm going to bring it up for you here, is accusative of extent of time and space. And in both Greek and Latin, the accusative case is used to show the extent, right, or the range of both space and time. Okay? So take, for example, this sentence, Emeinen hemeras hepta, or in Latin, mansit dies septem. And you see the words I've highlighted in yellow there. He remained 7 days. Right, the 7 days phrase, that's the extent of time that he remained, maybe in the town or wherever. For some of us, it might be in the pipe shop. But you put that in the accusative case. But then you also use the accusative case for what we call extent of space. So, for example, exelaune stadia octo, or in Latin, procedit mille passuum. He advances, the Greek measurement 8 stades, or the Latin measurement 1 mile. Either way, we're talking about an extent of space. Now, what I find interesting about all that is that long before Einstein came along and was showing us the connection between space and time, all right? Think about that, space-time. In fact, we even talk about space-time these days. Thousands of years before that, the Greeks and Romans had that baked into their language. It was already there. And again, we're not at all saying that the Greeks and Romans had a notion of Einsteinian space-time. Of course not. But it's interesting that their language had that conception that somehow space and time should have the same form. In this case, the accusative case of nouns. So as we draw this one to a close, and these have been 2 really heady episodes, and I got to say, I've been just geeking out, nerding out over these. I just couldn't wait to do both of these videos. If you like this kind of thing, please click subscribe. We'd love to have you part of the fun over here at Perkins Pipes. If you'd like to talk with me about any of these kinds of things via Zoom, please email me, perkinspipes@gmail.com, and you could be on an episode of Brierside Chat. But once again, I want to leave you with the question, what do you think of all this? What do you think of the idea that the ancients seem to have had some intuitive, maybe not fully developed, conscious cognitive thought about it, but some intuitive sense about some of these deeper scientific things? I don't know, where's your mind go with that? Let me know what you think. As Malcolm Guite likes to say, I do these little things in order at last to do nothing, or as I like to say in Latin, Parva ago ut tandem, nihil agam. Have a wonderful day.